someone here that I'd like to introduce to you, and I'm going to get to know him as you get to know him. His name's Pete Garcia. Pete, welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Big hand. Tell us a little bit about yourself. Where you come from, what do you do, and what are you trying to do in your ministry?
So I am from Texas. Live in Decatur, Texas right now. Been married to my wife now for 17 years. I was in the Army for 22 years as a medevac pilot. I've since retired. I began my ministry actually in 2011 with Jack Kinsella's Omega Letter, and I was under his tutelage for a number of years. And then by 2018, I think we finally shut the website down, and I began Rev 310. So I've been writing. I do a prison ministry on the side, and pretty much anywhere that I get invited to speak, I'll go talk, and so I just love teaching.
And you used to fly those 747s, right?
No, Blackhawks. Blackhawks,
yeah. Okay, I was wrong.
Well, no, I was going into the airlines. I actually had a conditional job offer for that, and then that was January of 2020. I was getting ready to go. I think March, April timeframe was my arrival to United, their training center in Houston. And then COVID obviously shut everything down, so that was kind of nixed. So God had other plans.
Well, I always wanted to get a helicopter rating, and I never did.
Yeah, they're fun.
Oh, they are.
Yeah. So
let's go and kind of take a little trip.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Appreciate it, sir. Thank you, guys. And if I can brag on Gary a little bit, if you've not had a chance to listen to his Bible studies on YouTube or whatever, just the individual ones where he does them, they are amazing. They are absolutely amazing. Some of the best teaching I've ever sat under or listened to. So good afternoon. Hopefully I don't have any audio issues like I did this morning. Everybody's good? All right. So this topic that I'm doing now is called the Vanishing Point. And you know the scenario, right? You're talking to a friend, a relative, a coworker, whoever, about being in the last days, right? And you start to get that look in their eye. You can see that look. You already know what's coming, right? Wow, we've always been in the last days. Or my grandmother said we were in the last days. And you get a whole number of excuses, kind of dismissing this idea that we're living in the last days. And so I got to thinking about, well, what are like the irrefutable signs? What are the irrefutable things that we could point to show that unbeliever, that show that skeptic, that we are actually living in the last days? And something that's tangible that they can look at and see with their own eyes and recognize the lateness of the hour. So I think there's kind of three different, when you're looking at something like 2 Peter 3, where he's talking about in the last days, scoffers will come, there's kind of three different perspectives that they'll give you. They'll give you one is like a ad hominem attack, which is like they're attacking the idea that it's preposterous. Can't happen. There's no such thing as a rapture, blah, blah, blah. You have the next thing is called a hasty generalization. These are logical fallacies, right? And the hasty generalization says that because it's never happened in history, from their perspective, right, that it can never happen in the future. And the last one is like a normalcy bias. They look at yesterday, or they gauge tomorrow based off of yesterday and today. And so they always live in this kind of perpetual state that tomorrow is going to be just like today. And obviously, one of the things I love to point out to people is look at September 10th. Remember, think back to where you were in September 10th, 2001. I think that was a Monday. And I was in college at the time. I was finishing my senior year. And I'd already been finished with my military ROTC program at this point. I'd already served as an enlisted soldier, got out, went back to college. And I remember thinking, waking up September the 11th, that morning. I lived in an old apartment. It was built in the 1940s in a college town there. And we didn't have TV. We didn't have a TV plugged into the wall. Obviously this is before smartphones and all that. And my roommate comes running in that morning and saying we're under attack. So we had to drive over to somebody's house that actually had TV that connected to the news to see what was going on. And, I just remember thinking that day, like, how many people yesterday were sitting in school, were maybe thinking, well, I'm retiring tomorrow on the 11th is my last day at this job, last day in the military. Oh, I'm going to make all these plans for the future. And then the next day completely gets flipped on its head, right? And so that's this mentality that we're trying to shake people out of, this idea of the normalcy bias, because when the rapture happens, and not if, but when it happens, it is going to turn this world upside down. And it is going to usher in this time that Jesus says is the worst that's ever and will ever exist, right? So this idea of the vanishing point is something that has kind of been on my mind for the last few months. So if we think about the two definite signs, obviously the first has to be Israel. And last night, even this morning, I woke up to the news that Israel was at war. And just looking at the footage of that on Telegram or whatever you get your news from, or even earlier when we had Bill Salas and Bill Koenig up talking about it, the shock value of yesterday, Israel was one way, thinking that tomorrow was going to be the same as it was yesterday, and yet they're at war, right? That's how fast things can change. Here we read in Amos 9:14 through 15, which is one of my favorite passages to go to talk about the fact that Israel being back in our land is the key sign for the last days, to know we're in the last moments of the last days. It says, I will bring back the captives of my people Israel. They shall build the waste cities and inhabit them. They shall plant vineyards and drink wine from them. They shall also make gardens and eat fruit from them. And I will plant them in their land, and no longer shall they be pulled up from the land I have given them, says the Lord your God. This could have never happened in history. It couldn't happen in the Babylonian when they were conquered by Nebuchadnezzar in 605 to 587 BC. Right? They got conquered a second time by the Romans in 70 AD by Titus and his Roman legions. Right? It can only apply to now. This is the only time it could apply to. And so Israel is the key sign. The second sign is the convergence. And I know convergence has been on a word that many of you have become familiar with over the years, at least since maybe 2015 or so. And we read in Matthew 24:33, Jesus says, when you see all these things happening, know that I am near, even at the door. All these things, not some of them, but all of them. And furthermore, he goes and likens it to birth pangs, right? We understand that. Jesus uses that phraseology, if I can use that word. Paul talks about also similar to that, birth pains, where these things are going to come on and they're going to increase with frequency and intensity and keep faster, harder, until they come to a culmination point. My question was, how long will this convergence go on? Will it go on indefinitely? Or is there an end state to it? Is there a shelf life to all the things we're seeing right now? So the term vanishing point is the definition of it is a point at which receding parallel lines seems to meet when represented in a linear perspective, a point at which something disappears or ceases to exist. It's an optical illusion that when you look, for instance, at this railroad track, you have these two linear lines that are going, and as they go down the distance, or maybe it's a road or whatever it is, a straight line, you see these things actually come to a point and they disappear into each other. And that's where I think we are today. We're seeing all these things coming together so fast that they're starting to get blurred together, and eventually we're not going to be here to see it. When his disciples asked Jesus what would be the sign of his coming in Matthew 24 in the Olivet Discourse and of the end of the age, Jesus answered them with a list of obvious things to look for, such as wars, rumors of wars, pestilences, earthquakes, signs in the heavens, deception, the love of many growing cold. And truth be told, all of these signs have been present in every century since he first spoke those words on the Mount of Olives. However, Jesus didn't leave us with this generic signs. He first stated that these signs would be, as I mentioned before, like birth pangs, increasing in both frequency and intensity. And secondly, he gave two specific qualifiers that would narrow the window down significantly when the national rebirth, or these are the national rebirth of Israel and the convergence of all the signs. He begins the Olivet Discourse by describing the destruction of the temple, which was the very epicenter of Jewish culture, government, and the law. Then he discusses the signs, the 12 signs, both in Matthew and Luke's version of the Olivet Discourse, and that culminates with the abomination of desolation. And Jesus here refers back to Daniel 9:27, which indicates a rebuilding of a third temple. So he starts off the Olivet Discourse saying the temple is going to be destroyed, gives all these signs, and then says this temple is going to be desecrated. So there is some reading into it somewhat that this temple has to be rebuilt at some point, right? And so when you do in the military, we were very fond of this thing called backwards planning. And you start from the event, the operation, the assault, the breach, whatever we're going to do that day. You start from that moment when you kick in the door and you backwards plan. And that's how you can know that you're going to hit that time on target exactly at the minute and the second, maybe plus or minus 10 seconds, of when you're going to conduct this operation. So backwards planning, in order for there to be a third temple, the Jews must have control of the Temple Mount. In order to have control of the Temple Mount, they must have control of Jerusalem. In order to have control of Jerusalem, the Jews must be a nation again, controlling the land of Israel. And since 1948, we've lived in that reality. You know, think back to 1947 and before, Israel existed only in the history books. And many of us have kind of taken it for granted that Israel's a nation because I was born after they were a nation. But think about the people that were born prior to 1948. And I think it has more impact to them necessarily than maybe to us because we've just become accustomed to the idea of them being a nation. But for so many centuries, history was a dead nation. It was a dead language. The peoples were there. They existed in different cultures, but they didn't have a place to call their own. So on one track, we have Israel. And the other track, I put convergence. And at the end state, we have what we call the vanishing point. I'm going to read this quote. This is from Mark Twain. He went to Israel in 1867, and he wrote about it in his book, Innocents Abroad, in 1881. And, quote, he says, "A desolate country whose soil is rich enough but is given wholly over to weeds, a silent, mournful expanse. We never saw a human being on the whole route. There was hardly a tree or a shrub anywhere. Even the olive and the cactus, whose fast friends of a worthless soil, had almost deserted the country." So this is a picture of Jerusalem, Palestine, as it was known then, which was a territory in the Ottoman Empire, 1875. Jerusalem, 2022. Reading from Isaiah 11. "And it shall come to pass in that day that the Lord shall set his hand again the second time to recover the remnant of his people who are left from Assyria and Egypt, from Pathros and Cush, and from Elam and Shinar, from Hamath and the islands of the sea. And he will set up a banner for the nations, will assemble the outcasts of Israel, and gather together dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth." In Matthew's version of the Olivet Discourse, Jesus confirms that Israel as a city would remain and one day would host a third Jewish temple. We see in the Luke version of the Olivet Discourse that the Gentiles would trample Jerusalem until the times of the Gentiles is complete. Amos, as I read prior, 9:11 through 15, states that Israel would be restored and never to be removed again. Reading here just right now, Isaiah 11 states that a second time Israel would be established. So the first time that Israel was brought back as a nation was after they were conquered by the Babylonians. They came out of that Babylonian captivity. Cyrus the Persian let them go. We see the rebuilding of the city and the walls under Nehemiah about a century after that. And they were a nation, essentially, for the next 2 or 3 centuries until eventually the Romans came in and kind of dominated and took over again. Ezekiel 37 shows the literal and long-awaited resurrection of a nation being made whole again, the valley of dry bones, putting back on sinew and flesh. In quoting Mark Twain again, he says, "If statistics are right, the Jews constitute but 1% of the human race. It suggests a nebulous, dim puff of stardust lost in the blaze of the Milky Way. Properly, the Jew ought hardly to be heard of, but he is heard of. He always has been heard of. He is as prominent on the planet as any other people, and his commercial importance is extravagantly out of proportion to the smallness of his bulk. His contributions to the world's list of great names in literature, science, art, music, finance, medicine, and abstruse learning are also a way out of proportions to the weakness of his numbers. He has made a marvelous fight in this world in all the ages and had done it with his hands tied behind him. The Egyptian, the Babylonian, and the Persian rose, filled the planet with sound and splendor, and then faded to dream stuff and passed away. The Greek and the Roman followed and made a vast noise, and they are gone. Other people have sprung up and held their torch high for a time, but it burned out. And they sit in the twilight now or have vanished. The Jew saw them all, beat them all, and is now what he always was, exhibiting no decadence, no infirmities of age, no weakening of his parts, no slowing of his energies, no dulling of his alert and aggressive mind. All things are mortal but the Jew. All other forces pass, but he remains. What is the secret of his immortality? Well, we know the secret, right? It's the God of the Bible. God has sustained them despite the diaspora, despite being scattered to the four corners of the world, despite being conquered, despite the pogroms, the Holocaust, the anti-Semitism, and all the things that have plagued the Jewish people and Jewish culture around the world, and even their own blindness, right? Paul says in Romans 11 that they have a blindness put on them for a time. Going back to Israel, Palestine in 1875 to Jerusalem, Israel, 2022, obviously that didn't happen in a vacuum. We see this stair-stepping of events that begin to happen that if you were alive in 1897, this might not even made the news to you. You might have heard of it. Most likely you wouldn't have. The First Zionist Congress in 1897. And the backdrop of that was rising anti-Semitism in Europe. 1914 to 1918, we had World War I. Before that war was even finished, Lord Balfour in England decided that he supported the idea of allowing the Jews to go back to their homeland. And so they came up with what's called the Balfour Declaration. This was later confirmed in the San Remo Conference in 1920 with the League of Nations, which was the predecessor to the United Nations. 1939 to 1945, we have World War II. 1945, the Holocaust ends, and more importantly, the world begins to learn about the atrocities that happened to the Jewish people under the Third Reich. 1947, United Nations Resolution 181 allowed for the partitioning of an Arab and Jewish state. Obviously, May 14th, 1948 was Israel's declaration, and they, looking back at it, they didn't even know they were going to call it Israel at the time. That was kind of a last-minute decision. We were undecided whether to call it Zion or some form of Judah, and ultimately they ended up settling on Israel, which would begin to constitute the United Nation again, both the southern and northern kingdoms from the ancient past. The Six-Day War, 1967, the Yom Kippur War, the Camp David Accords, the Temple Mount Institute, the U.S. recognition of Jerusalem, and here as of late, the Abraham Accords. All of these things are pushing Israel into the last days and into their role that they're going to play here in the last days. Now to Convergence, again, Jesus saying, when you see all these things happening, know that I am near, even at the door. And certainly, maybe our grandmothers did say, they believed the Lord was going to come back in their day. Maybe some people thought Adolf Hitler was the Antichrist. Or even if you went back further in time to, say, the 15th century, during the Protestant Reformation, where the protesters were absolutely certain that the Pope was the Antichrist, and they were living in the last moments, and the world was going to end in 1666, there was a lot of things that people could look back at and say that generation applied to them. They believed that they were in the last moments of the last days. But none of them have what we have today. We have Israel back in her land, and we have all of the technological, geopolitical, and religious, cultural, social, governmental, financial things coming to a head all at the same time and increasing with speed and frequency and intensity. And I believe this was just within the last couple of years, all of these photos. Here are the signs listed between Matthew 24 and Revelation and how they overlap with each other. And then you go down to Luke's version and the Olivet Discourse, and then the signs in the epistles. And that's not even, I ran out of room. I mean, there's so many signs that I could put on there, but literally there's so many things that are beginning to happen right now. And I would even say, if you look down to the one right above Luke 21, the demonic invasion, think about where we are today as a nation and how much supernatural, paranormal, demonic things are taking place in their popular culture. And people are just losing their minds, or they're losing their abilities to reason and to even tell left from right, male from female. Just you could go on and on, but demonic possession is gaining speed in this land, as this nation's being given over to a debased mind. Obviously, we know that all of this is going to come to a head point, right? They're going to go for a global government, a global religion, and a global economy. All of these things are happening right now simultaneously. It's impossible for us to fully track everything that's happening as it's happening all at the same time. If you think about BlackRock, which is a major financial company, they have what they call Aladdin, which is an acronym. It's a supercomputer that basically does trillions of financial decisions, risk analysis, and all this stuff. All at the same time. It just does it all the time. If the Bible prophecy community had some kind of a supercomputer that we had our own and could track all this at the real time, we might be able to fully grasp everything that's happening. But we can't. There's none of us that can keep up with it. You can't keep up with it. We just don't have the mental bandwidth to keep up with how much is happening now. Go back to the 1990s. Think where you were in the 1990s, and if you were a student of prophecy back then, something would happen here, and then a year or two later, something might happen over here, and things were slow. And you could point to the Oslo Accords and think, oh man, that has to mean something. But then, a year goes by, 2 years goes by, nothing, and things are just really slow. But now we just can't keep up with it anymore. I mean, Billy Crone and Brandon Holthouse might be able to, but I certainly can't. I just don't have the mental bandwidth to do it. I don't know how they do it, but they do a good job of it. So I want to walk you through this, and I know this is a lot, and I want to talk through this because I want to show you the stair-stepping of where we were then to the world of Revelation 13. So, 1900, the world population was 2 billion. We are presently at 8 billion. Okay, so let's just keep that on the side. And then we got to think, too, there is a compounding effect. Once a technology is invented, once an event happens, it doesn't just fade away into nothing. Something happens. There's a cause and effect for those things. 9/11 happened. What happened after 9/11? We got the Patriot Act. You're starting to get strip searched at airports. Your phones are tapped. I mean, you could go on, but there is a cause and effect to what happened. So as these things happen, they are continually built upon, modified, tweaked, and then perfected to some degree, to some new abomination, if you can. So the world crisis here, and these are just general 10, 15-year time frames. Wasn't trying to get too specific. But if you look across the line, what was the world crisis then? The beginning of the 1900s, it was World War I. Prior to World War I want to say it was 1912, 1913, there was a book that came out. I want to call it The Great Illusion, if I'm thinking correctly. This isn't in my notes. I was just thinking about this. But the guy came out and said, war is done. The more capitalistic the world becomes, the less chances that war will happen, right? You know, there's a saying today, like if countries have McDonald's in them, they're less likely to go to war with each other. We have this idea that countries that want to make money and trade between each other don't want to fight each other and destroy all that wealth. Well, that was completely blown up. That whole theory was blown up in 1914, when the impossibility of war between Germany, Hungary against Russia, France, England, and pretty much everybody else went from, impossible to inevitable without ever going through improbable. It just happened so fast, right? What came out of that? You get the League of Nations. This was the world's first effort to unite the world's governments together. Shortly thereafter, we had the Great Depression. And think back to the idea of the Federal Reserve. What was the reasoning for the Federal Reserve? It was to prevent things like the Great Depression, because there was so much financial instability, because there was all these little mini depressions here and there. Well, the Federal Reserve was sold to the leadership there at Jekyll Island in 1909, I believe. And they said, hey, if we do this, this will fix our problems. We'll have a governing body apart from Congress that can control the spending, the interest rates, and so on and so forth. But then the United States, and then the world follows us at that point into the Great Depression. Think back to World War I, when it looks at technology. There's a saying that they rode into World War I on horses and came out on the other side in tanks and planes. How much technology had advanced in those 4 years simply due to war? Christendom. And I'm going to speak here in Christendom with regards to like Western civilization. You had this movement called modernism. Well, prior to modernism, what was the main thoughts in culture of Christendom prior to World War I? And you had the fundamentalists, which had been around for decades at this point. Modernism came about as universities began to turn secular. The introduction of higher criticism came in. People weren't taking the Bible all that seriously anymore. There's a whole laundry list of things, but this is all kind of wrapped up into modernism, and that became the new vogue movement within Christendom. And you're going to see some decades where they struggle back and forth. And then obviously in Israel there, we had what was called, or in Europe, the Balfour Declaration, allowing for Jews to repatriate back to their homeland. A couple decades later, we get World War II. Out of that came the United Nations. In regards to the global economy, we had the Bretton Woods Agreement. And what was the Bretton Woods Agreement? It was the agreement that the US dollar, and I'm summarizing it, would be the global currency, reserve currency for the world. And think back to the end of World War II, Europe was in shambles, China was in shambles, Russia was in shambles. The Middle East was still largely undeveloped and agrarian. They barely just discovered oil, and there was still not the economy for that yet to make the billions and billions that they would come to make in the future. So the U.S. became the sole superpower, the last man standing, if you will, in a world that had been devastated by war. We had all the gold, we had all the silver, we had a booming economy, and so we set the standard. And as an aside for this, when you hear terms today, even going back to, say, George Bush I in 1991, when he talked about a new world order, anytime any leader mentions a new world order in a sense that, hey, we need to move to that thing, that has to mean the diminishing or destruction of the United States. Because right now, the world order is set by the United States. So anything that's new means that the U.S. has to step down or be removed from the top of that pyramid. Obviously, out of World War II came the atomic age. Oppenheimer's creation of the atomic bomb, the use of it in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, changed the world. It changed warfare forever. And that would usher in the next, 60, 70 years, what we call the Cold War, as two superpowers arose and began to race towards nuclear superiority. In Christendom, we had the interfaith movement. This is where we began, as a United Nations, we began to lobby for the respect and that, what do they call that, where everything is considered equal between Islam, Buddhism, Christianity, all the different branches and sects within Christianity. We're all the same, we're all equal. Ecumenicalism. Israel, the declaration there of statehood, 1947, 1948. And as horrible as it is to think, I don't know that they would have won their statehood had the Holocaust not happened. There was just enough world sympathy at the newly created United Nations to authorize that Resolution 141. Following World War II, we entered to what they call the Cold War era. We have the creation of NATO, 1949, the creation of the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund. We had a budding arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union. In Christendom, we had what was called can't say it. You can read it. Evangelicalism or something. Think Billy Graham, big crusades, people partnering between different organizations. Okay, you get it. 1949, you get the creation of the Knesset. 1950s, the Red Scare, right? The hunt for communism within government, the military, Hollywood, universities, and so forth. Around the world, you have the end of colonialism as the British empires, the French, the Belgian. Obviously, the Ottoman Turks empire had collapsed in World War I, but now all these Western superpowers that had been superpowers for centuries because of their colonial reach now was beginning to crumble as these nations came out of them and declared their own independence, right? You used to say the sun never set on the British Empire, right? Well, it did. And you have the rise of the Bilderbergers. This is the coalescing of private industry with government decision makers meeting in private and deciding the direction they were going to drive the world in the future going forward. And these meetings are always secret. Press is not allowed. They're not allowed to take direct quotes and things like that. So you and we are not allowed into these meetings of where they're going to decide what the world's going to do. This began in the 1950s. Obviously, the space race began. And as I mentioned in my talk this morning with Operation Paperclip, we had brought over a lot of Nazi scientists that had also been developing this rocket technology in Germany prior to the end of World War II. And we wanted these scientists. We gave them American names, passports, brought them over. The Russians did the same thing. They took a bunch of these scientists and thus began the space race that would last for the next 2 decades. Christendom, think back to mass marketing, think to the rise of television, radio, outreach, these big Billy Graham crusades where he goes to Madison Square Garden and tens of thousands come, and this happens all over the world. But really with the rise of television, this begins a new market for evangelical leaders to go and spread the message, right? I'm having a time with that word. Suez Canal crisis. When Egypt stated, this was in 1956, I believe, they stated they were going to nationalize the Suez Canal. They obviously made the British angry, and the British and the Israelis got together and said, hey, we're going to not let this happen. And somehow the United States gets involved. And it becomes the first big kind of quagmire, the first big issue that Israel and the United States would have. going forward. Organized crime. Now, you don't really think about this in terms of a world crisis, but when you get the Cosa Nostra from Italy and those old mafia families, different crime organizations around the world, as they begin to ramp up how they're going to commit crimes, the ferocity in which they do it, the reach that they have, and where they're going to go into and what industries they're going to begin to hijack, it forces law enforcement to become more militarized in order to be able to stop them. And this is just an escalation of the militarization of law enforcement around the world, whether you're talking about the FBI, state police, ATF, DEA, so on and so forth. This will be a trend that we'll see moving forward, but it began with really the rise of organized crime, with, for instance, like the mafia, to take advantage of the lackadaisical nature of law enforcement. You know, think about Mayberry, Andy Griffith. And I know it's a show, and I know things aren't that idyllic in most places, but back in the day, in small towns, you have, a little police force. Nothing much happens. They might give a ticket every once in a while, or there might be a drunk falls asleep in the park or something. But think about how organized crime begins to move into these small places and take over. It forces that police department to militarize and to become more aggressive in their tactics, in the weapons that they use and carry, in the strategies that they carry out. I mean, it had to happen. It was cause and effect, right? Crime escalates. Law enforcement has to react and actually be stronger and better than that to stop it, to prevent it. Trilateral Commission. Obviously you have within the, I wanted to say it's the United States, Japan, and Great Britain, again, are starting to think internationally, setting aside just the needs of their nation, and now are starting to think about regional, global partnerships. And the Trilateral Commission is all about internationalization, the diminishing of sovereignty of the United States, and really bring us under the thumb of some global body. The removal of the gold standard, by the mid-60s, we were already involved in Vietnam. After the death of JFK, we have LBJ's Great Society Initiative, and between those two events right there, begin to bankrupt us as a nation. And by the time Nixon comes in, he has to get the U.S. off the gold standard. And so we went off the gold standard and we went into a free-floating debt-based currency that, we're at 33 trillion today. Obviously it can go. It's got a long legs on it. But we got off the gold standard, and now we're going to start putting ourselves into financial harm. You have the automation within technology. When you think about all the industrial revolutions, first, second, third industrial revolutions, this is the third industrial revolution where things are beginning to be put onto computers and through machines and systems rather than somebody actually doing it by hand, right? Also within the 60s and early 70s, you have the counterculture movement. That goes from the sexual revolution to the hippies to the Beatles, so on and so forth, rock and roll. And I'm not knocking all that. I'm just saying that is a result of what happened then. Excuse me. 6-Day War obviously shocked the world, shocked the Arab world. But Israel would go on to prove that every time they're attacked, that something is going to, their borders are going to continue to increase. We see the rise in the 70s of terrorism, namely Islamic terrorism. Again, begins to change how nations are going to begin to continue to militarize. Thank you. We have the coalescing of the European Union. It began in the 1950s, and you start having all these treaties every so many years, the Maastricht Treaty, the Treaty of Rome, and so on and so forth, that we're starting to see Europe come together. The PetroDollar, obviously Nixon was in a bind, and I would think Ford was as well. that as we supported Israel, for instance, with the Six-Day War and the Yom Kippur War in 73, the Arabs decide to boycott, or OPEC decides to boycott selling to the United States. We make out a deal with them, with the Saudi royal family, and said, hey, we'll keep stability in your kingdom. We will back you up militarily, but you have to sell all your oil in US dollars. So what does that require? It requires everybody to keep reserve currency of US dollars in order to buy oil. And even that today has changed. That is no longer true. And that is a huge red flag showing that the United States is really on its last moments, its last legs. You have the development of the internet, 1960s, beginning with the military and with certain universities, very small, very interconnected. It was just within small organizations. We see the birth of this and begin to expand into industry. And eventually what we'd see in the 90s is the introduction of things like AOL and dialing up and plugging into the telephone lines, etc. But everybody's starting to get connected online. The 1973 Yom Kippur War obviously would put a strain on the U.S. relations with the Arabs, and that's where the birth of that PetroDollar came out of. The world crisis going forward into the 1980s and the 90s is environmentalism. Whether it's famine in Africa, think about We Are the World, 1985, due to the desertification of Ethiopia and places where deserts just overtaking the land, the melting of the ice caps, Al Gore's, it was going to be global cooling and then global warming, and then climate change, and then it's just kind of whatever. But they're using the environment as an excuse to implement all these rules and taxations in ways to control human population. Obviously, from 9/11 forward, we had the war on terror. We have the diversification of how we pay for things. You have cash, cards, debit cards, or credit cards, now debit cards, checks, and now even where we are today, you pay by Venmo, PayPal. I mean, there's 100 different ways to pay for things now. We have the diversification of money, the creation of artificial intelligence. Obviously, other speakers have talked about that. I'm not going to go too much into it. But what was seen as kind of a novelty then is becoming of a critical importance today. Ecumenical movements within Christendom, people back in 2015 or so, you had the Roman Catholics ending the schism between Catholics and Protestants at the 400th anniversary, or 2017, of the Protestant Reformation. We see at the end of 40 years that the Land for Peace that began in 1977 at Camp David Accords has failed and continues to fail. And this is right at the time that Trump came in, began doing the recognition of Jerusalem, and then ultimately moving the embassy to Jerusalem. And here we are today in the 2020s. The idea that UFO disclosure, something that most people in the United States and around the world knew existed since Roswell, 47 or so, or before, the government has finally come out and admitted that this is real. So why now, right? You have the Great Reset. The Great Reset is this plan to totally reset the planet, the world order, which means the United States has got to step down from the top, and this new global organization is going to take over. We have the introduction of biometric digital currency, using your hand to pay, your eye, so on and so forth. Quantum technology, and I think between AI and quantum, these are the new arms races going forward. Postmodern movements within Christianity. Most churches across America today are unwilling to take a stand in the culture fight. They're beginning to affirm gay priests, preachers, trans, and all the other stuff. And it's a wave that's sweeping over the United States and over Western civilization at large. Last but not least, with Israel, we have the Abraham Accords, which I believe may play some role going forward between the normalization between Israel and these other nations, given what's happening last night and today, we'll see whether that becomes some kind of Psalm 83 event, or maybe a precursor to Ezekiel 38 or some other conflict that may take place. But it's not going to slow down. It's going to keep escalating. It's going to keep going harder and faster and harder and faster. And you guys are not going to catch a break until the Lord takes us up, which is the next world crisis. I've read a lot of reports from the NSA and all these different agencies that try to predict what the next major crisis is going to be. Not a single one of them mentioned the rapture, which is why I think it's going to catch them by surprise. We know that after the rapture, the world's going to be thrown into chaos for some period of time. You'll have what they call the 10 kings, the 10 regions. Maybe it's the United Nations that restructures itself into 10 areas, much like the Club of Rome had done. The U.S., when the rapture happens, my firm belief, the U.S. collapses economically because we're almost there already. Wouldn't take much. You remove 10 to 30 million Christians all at once who are no longer paying mortgages, no longer showing up to work, no longer paying their bills, et cetera, et cetera. That'll be the straw that broke the camel's back. Embedded technology, this is going to be going into the human body, and eventually we know where this is headed. What's left after the rapture is going to be an apostate system. Israel will at some point enter into this covenant with death, spoken of in Isaiah 28, leading to the rise of the beast kingdom, the mark of the beast. And folks, I have 42 seconds left. I'm trying to hurry. So it certainly appears that whatever the distance was between then and now has vanished. And what is the distance between Israel and Convergence has vanished. Which begs the question, are you ready? Do you know Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior? Because that is the most important thing. That's the most important decision you could ever make in your entire life. Remember what Jesus said. Now, when these things begin to happen, look up, lift up your heads, because your redemption draws near. Thank you. Maranatha.